The needle snapped between Alara Voss's fingers just as the shop door slammed open, and she flinched so hard she knocked over a tray of pins. A tall man in a gray coat stood in the doorway, breathing fast, his eyes scanning the room like he expected trouble. Behind him, the street was full of shouting carriage drivers and a crowd gathering around an overturned cart. "I need this fixed. Now, not in an hour. Now." His voice was sharp, used to being obeyed. He threw a torn ceremonial coat onto the table, and the fine gold thread along its edge was ripped clean through. "There is a dinner at the palace in 2 hours, and I am expected to stand in front of half the city looking like I did not just fall off a horse." Ilara did not answer right away. She kept her head down, the way she always did, letting her hair fall forward to hide the left side of her face. She picked up the coat and studied the tear. "This will take time," she said quietly. "The thread is imported. If I rush it, the stitching will show. I don't care if it shows. I care that it holds." She looked up then, only for a moment, and their eyes met. He did not look away first. Most people looked away first, or worse, they stared too long at the scar that ran from her jaw down to her collarbone, a mark left behind by a fire that had taken her parents when she was 12 years old. This man's eyes stayed exactly where they should, on her face, waiting for an answer, nothing more. "Sit," she said, surprising herself. "Or better, stand still. I will need the coat on you to match the seam properly." He raised an eyebrow, clearly not used to being told what to do by anyone, let alone a seamstress in the back room of a modest shop on a side street. But he obeyed, shrugging the coat over his shoulders and standing straight while she worked. Up close she could see him better. He was younger than she had guessed from his voice, maybe 30, with dark hair pushed back and a jaw set so tight it looked like it never relaxed. His eyes were a pale gray, almost silver, and they watched her hands as she pinned the fabric with quick, practiced movements. There was no impatience in his gaze now, only a strange kind of focus, as though he found the work itself interesting. "You're fast," he said after a while. "I've had practice. How long have you been sewing?" "Since I was 13. She did not explain why. She never explained why to strangers, and this man, whoever he was still a stranger, even if his coat cost more than she earned in a year. The shop owner, a nervous woman named Mildred, poked her head through the curtain and went pale the moment she recognized the visitor. "Your Grace," she stammered, bowing so quickly she nearly knocked over a shelf. "I did not know you were the one who, I would have sent for someone more suited to." "She is suited fine," the man said, cutting her off without even glancing her way. "Leave us." Mildred disappeared behind the curtain so fast it was almost funny, and Ilara felt her stomach drop. "Your Grace." That meant nobility, and not the ordinary kind. She had heard the name whispered around the city before, always with a mix of respect and fear. "You're the Duke," she said, before she could stop herself. "The Iron Duke." Something flickered across his face, something that might have been amusement, or might have been irritation. "Is that what they call me now? They say you never lose a negotiation. They say you turned down 3 marriage proposals from noble families in 1 season, because none of them were useful enough to you. And what do you think of that?" She kept her eyes on the seam, pulling the thread tight. "I think people who are talked about that much rarely have time to sit still for a seamstress." He laughed then, short and surprised, like the sound had escaped before he could stop it. "Fair enough." She finished the repair in under an hour, faster than she had promised, and the stitching along the tear was so fine it was nearly invisible, matching the gold thread for thread. He studied it in the mirror, turning his shoulder this way and that, and for a moment he said nothing at all. "This is better work than my tailor in the capital," he finally said. "What is your name?" "Ilara." "Ilara," he repeated, like he was testing the shape of it. "I am Duke Roderick Thornwood. I will need more work done before the season ends. I trust you'll be available." It was not a question. It was the kind of statement rich men made when they assumed the world would simply arrange itself around their schedule. And yet there was something in the way he said it, something that did not feel like the careless command of a man who saw her as beneath his notice. It felt, oddly, like a decision he had made on purpose. "I work here most days," she said. "Good." He reached into his coat and placed a small pouch of coins on the table, far more than the repair was worth. Before she could refuse it, he was already turning toward the door. Then he stopped, his hand on the frame, and looked back at her. Her hair had slipped, just slightly, and the scar on her neck was visible in the afternoon light coming through the window. She braced herself for the look she always got, the flicker of pity or disgust that people tried and failed to hide. It did not come. He simply nodded once, as if he had seen nothing unusual at all, and walked out into the noise of the street. Alara stood there for a long moment after the door closed, her fingers still holding the needle, her heart beating strangely fast. She told herself it meant nothing. Rich men were unpredictable. He probably had not even noticed the scar, or if he had already forgotten it, the way important people forgot most things that did not concern them directly. But that night, lying awake in the small room above the shop where she lived alone, she kept thinking about the way his eyes had stayed on her face and nowhere else. She thought about how strange it was that a man with a reputation for coldness had actually laughed, in her presence. She thought about the coin pouch, heavier than it needed to be, and wondered if it was simply generosity or something else entirely. She pushed the thought away. Men like Duke Roderick Thornwood did not think twice about seamstresses. He had a city full of noble daughters competing for his attention, women with unblemished skin and old family names and dowries large enough to matter. She had none of those things. She had a small shop, a burned hand that ached when the weather turned cold, and a scar that made strangers whisper behind their fans whenever she walked past. Still, as she drifted toward sleep, she found herself hoping, just a little, that he would come back. He did come back, 3 days later, this time without the urgency of a torn coat. He walked into the shop in the middle of the afternoon, when the light was soft and gold, and told Mildred plainly that he wished to speak with Alara about a new commission. Mildred, still nervous around him, ushered him to the back room so fast that she nearly tripped over her own skirts. "I need a full set of formal wear," he said, once they were alone. "Waistcoats, at least 4, a winter coat, and whatever else you think a man in my position should not be caught wearing at the wrong event." Alara raised an eyebrow. "You want my opinion on your wardrobe? I want competence. You clearly have it. There are seamstresses closer to the palace, seamstresses with better reputations, better shops, better everything. I did not ask for better. I asked for you." The words hung there in the small room, heavier than he probably meant them to be. Alara busied herself with her measuring tape, wrapping it around her hand simply to have something to do with her fingers. "Very well," she said. "Stand still." Over the following weeks, his visits became a strange and steady rhythm in her life. He came for fittings, for fabric choices, for opinions she had not expected him to actually want. He asked her questions about her work that no client had ever asked before, questions about how she chose her stitches, how she matched colors, why she preferred certain fabrics for certain seasons. At first she answered carefully, guarded, waiting for the moment his interest would fade the way everyone's interest eventually did. But the moment never came. Instead, he started asking questions that had nothing to do with sewing at all. "Where did you learn your trade?" he asked one afternoon, while she pinned the shoulder of a half-finished coat. "My mother taught me, before the fire." He did not flinch at the mention of it, the way most people did. He simply waited, quiet, giving her space to say more or to say nothing at all. She chose to say a little more than she usually did. "My parents ran a small tailoring shop, not far from here. There was an accident with a lamp one night. I was the only one who made it out. And the scar is from that night, yes." She kept her voice steady, the way she had practiced for years, so that the words would not shake even if her hands sometimes did. "People assume it means something about me, that I am fragile, or unlucky, or that I bring bad things with me wherever I go. That sounds like the opinion of people who have never had to survive anything themselves." She looked up at him then, surprised by the sharpness in his voice, the way he said it like a fact rather than a comfort. Most people offered comfort when they heard her story, soft words meant to smooth over the discomfort of hearing it. He did not offer comfort. He offered something closer to respect, and somehow that meant more. "You do not ask about it the way others do," she said. "I find most questions people ask are really just excuses to stare longer." He studied the coat in the mirror, adjusting his collar. "I would rather know the truth than gather material for gossip. And what do people say about you? The Iron Duke, who has no patience for weakness, who turned down 3 proposals in a single season." A faint smile crossed his face. There and gone so quickly she almost missed it. "They are not entirely wrong. I have little patience for people who pretend to feel things they do not feel, simply because it is convenient for their family's position. I would rather be alone than spend my life next to someone who sees me as a business arrangement." "And is that why you keep coming back here? Because a seamstress's shop is the one place where no one is trying to arrange anything with you?" He turned to look at her properly then, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The afternoon light caught the gold thread of the coat between them, and somewhere outside a bell rang in the distance, marking the hour. "Perhaps," he said finally, "I keep coming back because this is the one place where someone speaks to me honestly, instead of telling me what they think I wish to hear." Alara felt her cheeks warm, and turned back to her work quickly, focusing on a seam that did not actually need her attention. She told herself again that this meant nothing. Dukes did not fall for seamstresses. Dukes married titles and land and alliances, not women with burned skin and empty pockets. Whatever this strange, careful friendship was becoming, it could not become anything more than that. It would be foolish to let herself hope otherwise. And yet, when he left that evening, tipping his head toward her in a small gesture of respect before stepping out into the cooling street, she found herself smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember. It was a small thing, barely a smile at all, but it stayed with her long after the shop had gone quiet and the candles had burned low. She did not know it yet, but word of the Duke's frequent visits to a humble dressmaking shop had already begun to travel, carried from servant to servant, from carriage driver to shopkeeper, until it reached the ears of exactly the kind of people who loved nothing more than a scandal, wrapped in silk and gossip. Somewhere across the city, in drawing rooms far grander than Mildred's little shop, questions were already being asked about the scarred girl who had somehow caught the attention of the coldest man in Ashenmore. And soon enough, those questions would not stay quiet for long. The invitation arrived on a rainy Tuesday, carried by a footman in Thornwood colors who looked deeply uncomfortable standing in the doorway of a modest dress shop. Alara stared at the folded paper in her hands, her name written on the front in a firm, slanted hand she had come to recognize from the notes Roderick sometimes left with his measurements. "His Grace requests your presence," the footman said, "at the townhouse, tomorrow evening, for a private consultation regarding a formal event." Mildred nearly dropped the kettle she was holding. A private consultation? At his home? "Alara, do you understand what people will say if you go there alone?" "I understand," Alara said quietly, though in truth she did not fully understand yet how far the whispers would travel. She only understood that her hands were shaking slightly as she opened the letter, and that some small, foolish part of her was glad. The townhouse was grander than anything she had ever set foot inside. Marble floors stretched in every direction, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls of a hallway longer than her entire shop. A servant led her to a study where Roderick stood waiting, a stack of papers on the desk before him, his sleeves rolled up in a way that made him look less like a duke and more like an ordinary man who had simply forgotten to be formal. "You came," he said, and there was something almost relieved in his voice, quickly hidden behind his usual composure. "You asked me to. I did not think you would, given how it might look. I nearly did not." She set down her bag of supplies, pins and thread and a small notebook where she sketched designs late at night when she could not sleep. "But you said this was about a commission, and I do not turn away work, whatever people might say about it." He studied her for a moment, something unreadable in his pale eyes, and then gestured for her to sit. "There is a gathering at the end of the month, a gathering of significant families, the kind where every detail is noticed, and every detail is judged. I need something that does not look like it came from the same tailor every other man in that room will be wearing. You want to stand out. I want to look like myself, rather than like a copy of every other title in the city." He handed her a sketch, rough and clearly drawn by his own hand. Nothing like the polished designs she was used to seeing from professional tailors. It showed a coat with an unusual cut across the shoulders, sharper than fashion currently allowed. "I have ideas. I do not have the skill to make them real." "You do." Alara took the sketch and studied it carefully, surprised by how thoughtful it was, how much attention he had clearly put into the small details, the placement of buttons, the exact angle of the collar. "This is good," she said, meaning it. "Unusual, but good. Unusual is the point." They worked for hours that evening, longer than any fitting had ever taken, adjusting the design between them, arguing gently over small details, laughing more than either of them probably expected to. At one point he brought out tea, pouring it himself rather than calling a servant, and the simple, ordinary gesture struck her as strange coming from a man so many people described as cold and untouchable. "They call you the Iron Duke," she said, watching him set down the teapot with unusual care. "Yet here you are pouring tea like any other man." "Titles are for rooms full of strangers," he said. "In this room, there is only you." She did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and focused instead on measuring the width of his shoulders, her fingers brushing briefly against the fabric of his shirt. Neither of them mentioned how her hands lingered a moment longer than the measurement required. By the time she left that night, the rain had stopped, and the streets were washed clean and quiet under a pale moon. She walked home slowly, replaying the evening in her mind, unable to stop the small, warm feeling that had settled in her chest, despite every warning her own good sense tried to give her. The warm feeling did not last long. Within a week, the whispers had grown into something louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. It started with looks from customers in the shop, women who came in for simple alterations and left with pointed comments dressed up as polite conversation. "I heard the Duke visited your shop again," one woman said, her smile thin and cold. "How fortunate for business. Though I wonder what business exactly he is seeking." Ilara learned to keep her head down and her answers short, but the comments did not stop. They grew louder in the tea houses and drawing rooms she never entered but somehow always heard about, carried back to her through Mildred, who could not resist repeating the worst of it despite her clear worry for Ilara's feelings. "They are saying you have bewitched him," Mildred said one evening, wringing her hands. "That a woman with your circumstances could not possibly interest a man like him, unless she had done something unnatural to earn it. I do not believe it, of course, but Ilara, you must be careful. These are powerful families. They do not take kindly to being made to feel foolish." "I have done nothing wrong," Ilara said, though the words felt smaller than she wanted them to be. "I am simply doing my work. I know that. But knowing the truth has never stopped cruel people from believing whatever suits them best." Ilara tried to focus on her work in the days that followed, burying herself in fabric and thread the way she always had whenever the world outside felt too loud to bear. She told herself the gossip would fade, the way gossip always eventually did, replaced by some newer scandal, some fresher target for wagging tongues. But Roderick kept visiting, and every visit seemed to add fuel to the fire rather than let it die down. He did not seem to notice, or if he did not seem to care, arriving at the shop with the same steady confidence he always carried, unaware or unbothered by the way heads turned whenever his carriage stopped outside Mildred's modest storefront. "You should not come here so often," Ilara told him one afternoon, unable to hold the words back any longer. "People are talking. People are always talking. It is what they do instead of anything useful. This is different. They are talking about me, about us." The word slipped out before she could stop it, and she felt her face flush with embarrassment. "There is no us. I only meant, they are saying things that could hurt my business. Hurt Mildred's shop." He set down the fabric sample he had been examining and looked at her directly, his expression more serious than she had seen it before. "Tell me plainly, do you wish for me to stop coming here?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them expected. She thought of all the reasons she should say yes, all the sensible, practical reasons that had nothing to do with what she actually wanted. She thought of her scar, of her empty pockets, of the wide, unbridgeable gap between a duke's world and her own. "No," she admitted quietly. "I do not wish for that." "Then let them talk." His voice was firm, certain in a way that made her chest ache with something she did not have a name for. "I have spent my entire life listening to what other people think I should want. I am tired of it. I would rather spend my afternoons here, arguing with you over the placement of a button, than sitting through another dinner with someone who only wants my name and my land. You make it sound simple." "It is not simple, but it is worth it." He picked up the fabric sample again, turning it over in his hands, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened. "You are the only person in this city who speaks to me as though I am simply a man, rather than a title attached to a fortune. Do you understand how rare that is? How much I have come to value it?" Ilara did not trust herself to answer, so instead she returned to her work, though her hands trembled slightly as she threaded her needle. She wanted to believe him. Some quiet, hopeful part of her already did believe him, despite every warning she had given herself, despite every reason the world had given her to expect disappointment instead of kindness. That night, alone in her small room above the shop, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a different life. A life where a scar did not determine how a person was seen or valued. A life where a seamstress and a duke could simply be two people who enjoyed each other's company, without 100 watching eyes ready to tear the moment apart. She knew it was foolish to hope. She had learned long ago that hope was a fragile thing, easily broken by circumstances beyond her control. And yet, as she fell asleep that night, she found she could not quite let the hope go. Meanwhile, in a part of the city Ilara had never visited, and likely never would, a woman named Lady Camilla Ashworth sat in her drawing room, listening to her mother recount the latest gossip, with growing irritation. Camilla had spent the better part of 2 seasons positioning herself as the most likely candidate for the Duke's attention, carefully attending every event he was rumored to attend, laughing at every joke he made, no matter how dry or unamused he seemed. The idea that he had instead taken an interest in a common seamstress, a woman with a disfigured face no less, struck Camilla as not just insulting but almost impossible to believe. Surely it was a passing curiosity, a strange whim that would fade the moment he remembered his position and his responsibilities to his family name. But as the weeks passed and the whispers grew louder rather than quieter, Camilla began to understand that this was not a passing whim at all, and she decided, quietly and with the same cold determination that had won her every advantage she had ever wanted in life, that she would not simply stand by and watch her plans fall apart because of a girl who worked with needles and thread. She began asking careful questions among her circle, gathering small pieces of information about the seamstress and her past, about the shop where she worked, about the scar everyone seemed so curious about. She did not yet know what she would do with this information, but she intended to find the right moment to use it, and when that moment came, she intended to make sure everyone in Ashenmore understood exactly why a duke should never lower himself to notice a woman like Ilara Voss. Ilara, unaware of the storm quietly gathering against her, continued her work in peaceful ignorance for a little while longer, treasuring the strange, unexpected warmth that had grown between herself and a man the world called cold. She did not yet know how soon that warmth would be tested, or how cruel the coming weeks would prove to be. The fitting room at the Ashworth estate smelled of lavender and expensive candles, and Ilara had never felt more out of place in her life. She had been summoned there under the guise of a legitimate commission, a request delivered through a servant claiming that Lady Camilla required urgent alterations to a gown before an important social event. Mildred had been thrilled at the prestige of the request, unaware that the invitation carried a purpose far darker than a simple hem adjustment. Ilara arrived with her sewing bag, expecting a straightforward task. Instead, she found Camilla surrounded by 4 other young women, all dressed in silk finer than anything Ilara owned, all watching her with expressions that ranged from curious to openly hostile. "Ah, the seamstress," Camilla said, her voice sweet in a way that immediately put Ilara on edge. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I do apologize for the short notice, but I trust someone of your, shall we say, dedication to her craft would not mind the inconvenience." "I am happy to help, my lady," Ilara said carefully, setting down her bag. "What alterations do you require?" "The hem, mostly. It sits wrong at the back." Camilla turned in a slow circle, letting the gown swirl around her ankles. "Though I confess, I asked for you specifically, because I have heard so much about your talents. It seems half the city cannot stop discussing you these days." The other women exchanged glances, and Ilara felt her stomach tighten with the familiar, dreaded sense that something unpleasant was coming. "I only do my work, my lady. I cannot account for what people choose to discuss." "Of course not. Though it must be flattering, mustn't it, to have caught the attention of someone as sought after as the Duke. Tell me, how does a girl like you manage it? What is your secret?" The question was delivered with a smile, but the sharpness underneath it was unmistakable. Ilara kept her eyes on the hem of the gown, focusing on the measurements, refusing to let her hands shake despite the tension building in the room. "There is no secret, my lady. His Grace requires formal wear, and I provide it. That is the whole of it." "Is it? Because I have heard he visits your little shop rather often, for a man who could summon any tailor in the capital to his own home." Camilla's voice had taken on a harder edge now, the sweetness stretched thin over something colder. "I wonder what exactly you offer him there, in that back room of yours, that he cannot find anywhere else." The implication was clear, and Ilara felt her face burn with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "I offer him skilled work, my lady. Nothing more." "How curious, then, that skilled work should require so many private visits." Camilla stepped closer, and before Ilara could react, the other woman reached out and pulled aside the collar of her dress, exposing the scar along her neck for the entire room to see. "Perhaps this is your secret. Some men have strange tastes, don't they? Perhaps he finds this fascinating, the way one might find a curiosity at a traveling show." The room went silent for a moment, and then one of the other women let out a soft, cruel laugh, quickly covered by a hand but not quickly enough to hide it. Ilara felt something inside her chest crack, an old familiar pain rising up from years of similar moments, years of being stared at, whispered about, treated as something less than human because of a mark she had never chosen and could never remove. "Please," she said quietly, pulling her collar back into place with trembling hands, "do not do that again. Oh, do not be so sensitive. We are only curious." Camilla's smile had turned sharp, triumphant, delighted by the visible distress she had caused. "Surely you understand why people find this whole situation so strange. A duke, choosing to associate himself with someone so marked. It reflects poorly on him, don't you think? A man of his standing, seen so often with a woman who looks like she survived something out of a nightmare." Ilara's hands were shaking now, and she fought to keep her composure, to keep the tears that were burning at the edges of her eyes from actually falling in front of these women, who would surely delight in the sight of her crying. She began gathering her things, her fingers fumbling with the clasp of her bag. I believe the hem alteration can wait for another seamstress, she managed to say, her voice barely steady. Good day, my lady. Running away already? How disappointing. I thought you might have more resilience than that, given everything you've apparently already survived. Alara did not answer. She simply walked toward the door as quickly as dignity would allow, desperate to escape the room before the tears finally broke free. She did not make it far. The door to the fitting room opened before she reached it, and Roderick stepped through, his expression already dark, having apparently been informed of the gathering happening under Ashworth's roof and having arrived, it seemed, specifically because he suspected something was wrong. His eyes moved quickly over the scene, Alara's trembling hands, Camilla's triumphant expression, the other women's poorly hidden amusement, and something in his face went very cold and very still. Lady Camilla, he said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth, only a sharp, controlled fury that made even the confident young woman take an involuntary step backward. I would like an explanation for whatever has just occurred in this room. Your Grace. Camilla recovered quickly, dropping into a graceful curtsy, though her composure had visibly cracked at the edges. We were merely having a conversation, nothing more. A conversation. He looked at Alara, at the way she was still trying to steady her hands, at the faint redness around her eyes that told him everything the words could not. Alara, are you well? She could not speak, could only nod, though the nod itself felt like a lie. He crossed the room to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating off him, and when he spoke again, his voice was loud enough for the entire room to hear. I have tolerated a great deal of gossip in this city over the years. I have grown accustomed to being discussed, judged, speculated about, by people who know nothing of my actual life or my actual choices. I have never once bothered to correct it, because I did not consider it worth my time. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, settling on each face in turn. But I will not tolerate cruelty, not towards someone whose only fault is being more talented and more honest than every person currently standing in this room. Camilla's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence entirely drained away. Your Grace, I assure you, we meant no harm. You exposed a scar she did not choose to have removed from a fire that killed her family, for the entertainment of your friends. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending this was harmless. His voice was quiet now, but somehow more frightening for it. I came here today because I had heard rumors that you intended something unpleasant, and I had hoped, foolishly, that those rumors were exaggerated. I see now that they were not. He turned to Alara, his expression softening entirely as he looked at her, a stark contrast to the coldness he had just directed at the room. Come. I will take you home. Alara let him lead her out, too shaken to protest, too overwhelmed by everything that had just happened to think clearly about what his public defense of her might mean for both of them. Behind them, the fitting room remained utterly silent, the women too stunned by what they had just witnessed to say anything at all. The carriage ride back to the shop was quiet, neither of them speaking for a long while. Alara stared out the window, watching the city pass by in a blur, her mind replaying the humiliation of the fitting room over and over. I should not have gone there, she finally said. I knew something felt wrong the moment I arrived, and I went anyway, because Mildred was so excited about the commission, and I did not want to disappoint her. None of this is your fault. Roderick's voice was firm. Camilla has always been ambitious in ways that leave little room for kindness. I should have anticipated she might do something like this once the rumors reached her. The rumors will only grow worse now. Alara wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly very tired. You defended me in front of half the young women in this city. By tomorrow, everyone will know exactly what happened, and they will say far worse things than what Camilla said to my face. Let them say what they wish. That is easy for you to say. You have a title to protect you, a family name that shields you from whatever people whisper. I have none of that. I have a shop, a scar, and a reputation that can be destroyed by a single afternoon of gossip. Her voice cracked slightly, and she hated how weak it sounded, how much it revealed of the fear she had been trying to hide since the moment Camilla had reached for her collar. I cannot afford what you can afford to ignore. Roderick was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. You believe I have not thought about that, about what this means for you, specifically, and not just for myself. Have you? Every day since I first walked into that shop, he reached out, hesitated, then gently took her hand, his fingers warm against her cold ones. I know what it costs you to be seen with me. I know the world will judge you far more harshly than it will ever judge me, simply because it has always been easier for people to punish those with the least power to protect themselves. I have thought of little else these past weeks. Then why continue? Why not simply let this end quietly, before it grows into something neither of us can control? Because I do not want it to end. His grip on her hand tightened slightly, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried a rare vulnerability she had never heard from him before. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. My title, my land, my influence. You are the first person who has ever simply wanted to know me. I am not willing to give that up because a room full of jealous women decided to be cruel. Elara did not know how to answer him, so she said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them as the carriage rolled on through the city streets. When they finally arrived at the shop, she found she did not want to let go of his hand, though she made herself do it anyway, stepping down onto the pavement with a heavy heart. I need time, she told him quietly. Time to think about what all of this means. Time away from the shop, from you, from everything that happened today. His expression flickered with something like pain, quickly hidden. If that is what you need. It is. She did not look back as she walked into the shop, though she could feel his eyes on her the entire way, and she suspected, even as the door closed behind her, that this was not truly an ending, only a pause before whatever came next. In the days that followed, Elara threw herself into her work with a kind of desperate focus, hoping that busy hands might quiet a restless mind. She turned down Roderick's requests for visits, sending polite but distant notes explaining that she needed space to consider her position. Mildred, who had heard second-hand accounts of the incident at the Ashworth estate, hovered nervously around her, unsure whether to offer comfort or simply leave her alone with her thoughts. The gossip, as Elara had predicted, grew louder rather than quieter. Word of the Duke's public defense spread through every drawing room in the city, twisted and reshaped with each retelling, until the story bore only a faint resemblance to what had actually happened. Some said the Duke had declared his love openly in front of Lady Camilla. Others said Elara had used some kind of trickery to manipulate him into a scene of public humiliation against one of the city's most respected families. Neither version was true, but truth had never mattered much to gossip, and Elara found herself the subject of stares and whispers wherever she went, far more intense now than they had been before. She began to wonder, in the quiet hours of the night, whether Roderick had been wrong, whether some things truly could not survive the weight of public judgment, no matter how much two people might wish otherwise. She thought of her parents, of the shop they had built together with careful hands and quiet devotion, and wondered what they would think of the situation she now found herself in, torn between fear and a hope she could not quite make herself abandon. She did not yet know that Roderick, in the quiet of his own townhouse, was fighting a very similar battle, wrestling with a lifetime of expectations and a growing certainty that he could not simply let her walk away, no matter how difficult the path ahead might prove to be. 10 days passed without a single visit from the Duke, and Elara told herself repeatedly that this was exactly what she had asked for, exactly what she needed. And yet, each morning she found herself glancing toward the shop door a little too often. Each evening she found herself listening a little too closely for the sound of a carriage stopping outside. She hated how much she missed him, hated how quickly he had become a presence she measured her days against. Mildred noticed, of course, though she said nothing directly, simply offering extra cups of tea and quiet company whenever Elara's hands grew still over her sewing, lost in thoughts she was not ready to share. On the 11th day, a letter arrived, not delivered by a footman this time, but carried personally by Roderick himself, who stood outside the shop in the rain without an umbrella, looking nothing like the composed, untouchable Duke the city had come to know. Mildred let him in without a word, disappearing into the back room with unusual tact, leaving the two of them alone in the front of the shop. "You are soaked," Elara said, unable to think of anything else to say, her heart pounding in a way that made speech difficult. "I did not want to wait for a proper visit to be arranged. I was afraid you would refuse it." He pushed wet hair back from his forehead, water dripping onto the wooden floor. "I have thought of little else these past 10 days, and I could not stay away any longer. Roderick, please, let me speak, before I lose whatever courage brought me here in this weather." He took a breath, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something like nervousness cross his features, a vulnerability entirely unlike the confident, controlled man who had first stormed into her shop weeks ago. "I have spent my entire life being told what I should want. My family arranged 3 separate engagements for me before I turned 25. Each one ended not by my choice, but because I found some excuse, some flaw, some reason to delay. I told myself I simply had not found the right match. But the truth is, I had never once felt anything close to what I feel when I am with you." Elara's breath caught, and she gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. "You should not say things like that. Not after everything that happened at the Ashworth estate. Not when an entire city is already whispering about us." "I do not care what the city whispers." His voice was steady now, certain. all traces of nervousness burned away by conviction. I have spent 31 years living according to what other people expected of me, and I have never once been happy doing it. You are the only person who has ever made me feel like more than a title, more than a fortune, more than an obligation to be managed. I am not willing to lose that because a handful of jealous people cannot understand what they are seeing. They will never accept it. A duke and a seamstress. It is not simply unusual, Roderick, it is nearly unheard of. Your family, your responsibilities, your entire position in this city depends on alliances and appearances I cannot offer you. I do not need what you think I need. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the water still clinging to his eyelashes, the earnest intensity in his pale eyes. I need someone who tells me the truth even when it is inconvenient. Someone who sees value in careful, honest work rather than empty flattery. Someone who has survived more hardship in one night than most of the people in this city will face in their entire lives, and who still gets up every morning and creates something beautiful with her own two hands. I do not need a title beside my name, Ilara. I need you. Tears she had been holding back for days finally spilled over, and she did not try to stop them this time. You do not understand what it is like to be looked at the way they looked at me in that room. To have people assume, simply because of a mark on my skin, that I am somehow less deserving of respect, of dignity, of love. I have spent years building walls around myself so that those looks could not reach me anymore. And then you walked into my shop and every single wall I built started falling apart, and I do not know if I am brave enough to let that happen completely. You are the bravest person I have ever known. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wished, and when she did not, he gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. You survived a fire that took everything from you. You built a life, a skill, a reputation for yourself out of nothing but determination and talent. You have endured cruelty from people who will never accomplish half of what you have accomplished with your own two hands, and you have done it while carrying a scar that reminds you, every single day, of the worst night of your life. That is not weakness, Ilara. That is the deepest kind of strength I have ever witnessed. And if I let myself believe you, she whispered, if I let myself hope, and it all falls apart anyway, I do not know if I could survive losing you the way I have survived everything else. Then let me prove to you that you will not have to. He took her hand, holding it gently, as though it were something precious rather than simply a hand roughened by years of needlework. I cannot promise the world will stop whispering. I cannot promise every room we enter together will be kind. But I can promise that I will stand beside you in every one of those rooms, exactly as I did at the Ashworth estate, for as long as you will allow me to. Ilara looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between his smooth, uncalloused fingers and her own scarred, work-worn ones, and felt something inside her chest finally begin to loosen, some long-held tension she had carried for years without even realizing its full weight. I am frightened, she admitted quietly, not of you, of everything that comes after this moment, of what it means to try and to fail, in front of an entire city that is already watching us so closely. I am frightened too. He said it simply, without shame, and somehow that honesty did more to reassure her than any grand declaration could have. I have never done this before, not truly. I have gone through the motions of courtship, of arranged meetings and careful conversations, designed to please my family rather than myself. I have never once felt what I feel now, standing here, unsure of what you will say next, and terrified that you might ask me to leave. I do not want you to leave. The words left her before she could think better of them, and once spoken, she found she did not want to take them back. Something shifted in his expression, relief and hope mingling together in a way that made him look younger, less like the untouchable Iron Duke the city feared, and more like simply a man who had finally allowed himself to want something for his own sake. Then tell me what you do want, he said softly, and I will do everything within my power to give it to you. I want time, she said, thinking carefully now, choosing her words with the same precision she used when cutting fabric, unwilling to make a mistake that could not be undone. Time to trust that this is real, and not simply a passing curiosity that will fade once the novelty wears off. Time to prepare myself for whatever comes next, whatever difficulties we will face together. And I want honesty, always, even when it is difficult to hear. You will have both, for as long as you want them. And I want you to understand, she continued, her voice growing steadier now, that I will not hide. Whatever happens between us, I will not go back to keeping my head down, avoiding mirrors, letting other people's discomfort dictate how I see myself. I spent too many years doing that already. If we do this, we do it honestly, scar and all, in full view of anyone who cares to look. A slow smile spread across his face, warm and genuine, in a way she had rarely seen from him. I would not want it any other way. I did not fall for a version of you hidden behind careful angles and lowered eyes, Alara. I fell for the woman who told me plainly that my reputation was not enough to earn her respect, who argued with me over button placement as though I were simply another person and not a duke, who showed more courage in one conversation than most nobles show in a lifetime. I want all of you. I always have. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and for the first time since the humiliation at the Ashworth estate, she felt something close to peace settle over her. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside the small shop, warmed by candlelight and the quiet, growing certainty between them, none of that seemed to matter anymore. There is still the matter of your family, she said eventually, practical concerns returning even as hope continued to bloom in her chest. Your mother, your responsibilities, the alliances your family likely still expects you to pursue. This will not be simple, Roderick, no matter how certain we are of our own feelings. Nothing worth having has ever been simple. He squeezed her hand gently. My mother will need convincing, yes. There will be difficult conversations, and likely more cruelty from people like Camilla before this is finished. But I have made difficult decisions before, and I have never regretted choosing what was right over what was merely easy. I do not intend to start regretting my choices now. Mildred, who had been listening rather shamelessly from behind the curtain for longer than she probably should have, chose that moment to reappear, wiping suspiciously damp eyes with the corner of her apron. Well, she said, sniffling slightly, it is about time someone in this shop had a bit of good fortune, after everything. Alara laughed, a genuine, surprised sound that seemed to lighten the entire room, and Roderick's smile widened at the sound of it, as though he had been waiting weeks to hear exactly that. In the days that followed, their relationship no longer stayed hidden behind careful visits and quiet fittings. Roderick began escorting her openly to small gatherings, introducing her without apology or explanation to acquaintances who clearly did not know quite what to make of the situation. Some treated her with obvious discomfort, unwilling to hide their disapproval of a duke openly courting a common seamstress. Others, surprising Alara considerably, treated her with genuine warmth, curious about her work and impressed by her skill once they were given the chance to actually speak with her, rather than simply whisper about her from across a room. The gossip did not disappear entirely, of course. Camilla and her circle continued their quiet campaign of disapproval, and there were still moments, more than Alara would have liked, where she caught cold stares or overheard cutting comments meant to be just loud enough for her to hear. But with Roderick steadily beside her, refusing to be swayed by any of it, she found the sharp edges of those moments beginning to dull, replaced by a growing confidence she had not felt since before the fire had taken everything familiar from her life. Word eventually reached Roderick's mother, the formidable Duchess Wilhelmina Thornwood, who summoned her son to the family estate with a letter so severe that even Roderick admitted, with a rueful smile, that he was somewhat nervous about the coming conversation. He did not ask Alara to accompany him for that first meeting, understanding without needing to be told that some battles were his alone to fight, at least initially. He returned 3 days later, looking tired but resolute, and told Alara only that the conversation had been difficult, and that his mother remained unconvinced, though not entirely closed to the possibility of meeting her eventually. It was not the outcome either of them had hoped for, but it was not a complete refusal either, and Alara found she could accept that small, uncertain hope as enough. For now. She will come around, Roderick said, with more confidence than Alara suspected he actually felt. My mother values results above all else, and I intend to prove to her, over time, exactly how wrong her assumptions about you truly are. And if she never comes around? He took her hand, the same gesture that had become so familiar and so comforting over these past weeks, and looked at her with a steadiness that left no room for doubt. Then I will have made my choice regardless. I have spent enough of my life living for other people's approval. I do not intend to spend the rest of it the same way. Alara believed him, fully and completely, in a way she had not allowed herself to believe anything in a very long time. Whatever difficulties still lay ahead, whatever battles remained to be fought against gossip, tradition, and the disapproval of powerful families, she found herself facing them now not with the fear that had defined so much of her life, but with a steady, quiet courage she had not known she still possessed. The season was ending soon, and with it, the largest gathering of the year, an annual gala that drew every notable family in Ashenmore beneath one roof. Roderick had already made his intentions for that evening clear, though he had not yet told Alara the full extent of his plans. She only knew, from the determined look in his eyes whenever the gala was mentioned, that something significant was coming, something that would finally settle, once and for all, exactly where they stood in the eyes of the city that had spent so many weeks whispering about them. The night of the gala arrived cold and clear, stars scattered across a sky untouched by clouds, as though even the weather understood that something important was about to happen. Alara stood in front of the small mirror in her room above the shop, studying her reflection with a steadiness that would have surprised the girl she had been just a few months earlier. She had made the gown herself, of course, refusing every offer Roderick made to bring in the finest tailors in the capital. The dress was deep green, the color of quiet forests, with sleeves cut just short enough to leave her scar visible along her collarbone, rather than hidden beneath layers of fabric. She had debated the choice for days, torn between old habits of concealment and a new, hard-won desire to stop apologizing for something she had never chosen and could not change. In the end, courage had won. Mildred fussed over her hair, pinning it back from her face, rather than letting it fall forward the way Alara had worn it for years. "There," Mildred said, stepping back to admire her work, tears already gathering in her eyes. "You look like exactly what you are, a woman who has earned every good thing coming her way." "I am terrified," Alara admitted, smoothing the front of her gown with trembling hands. "Good. It means you understand how much tonight matters. But terrified does not mean unprepared. And you, my dear, have never been more prepared for anything in your entire life." The carriage arrived precisely on time, and Roderick stepped out to greet her personally rather than sending a servant, dressed in the very coat she had helped design that rainy evening weeks ago, the unusual cut across the shoulders exactly as they had planned it together. He stopped completely still when he saw her, his expression shifting through surprise, admiration, and finally something that looked remarkably like pride. "You are wearing it uncovered," he said quietly, his eyes moving briefly to her collarbone before returning to her face, exactly as they had the very first day they met. "I decided I was tired of hiding." Her voice shook only slightly. "If tonight is going to change everything, I want it to change while people see all of me, not just the parts that are easiest to accept." Something fierce and protective crossed his face, and he offered his arm with a formality that somehow felt more meaningful than any grand declaration could have. "Then let us give them all of you." The ballroom, when they arrived, was already filled with the glittering crowd of Ashenmoor's most prominent families, chandeliers throwing warm light across silk gowns and polished jewelry, the air thick with the sound of orchestral music and 100 overlapping conversations. Heads turned the moment Roderick and Alara entered together, conversations faltering mid-sentence as people took in the sight of the Iron Duke arriving not with some carefully selected noble daughter, but with the scarred seamstress who had been the subject of so much speculation these past weeks. Alara felt every eye in the room settle on her, felt the familiar urge to shrink smaller, to look away, to make herself as invisible as possible. But Roderick's hand tightened gently around hers, a silent reminder that she was not facing this alone, and she lifted her chin instead, meeting the curious stares with a steadiness that surprised even herself. They had not made it halfway across the room before Lady Camilla appeared, her expression carefully composed into something resembling polite interest, though the tightness around her eyes betrayed her true feelings. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a graceful curtsy. "And Miss Voss, how bold of you to attend together, given everything that was said after our last meeting." "Lady Camilla." Roderick's voice was cool, controlled, though Alara could feel the tension in his arm beneath her hand. "I trust you have had time to reconsider your behavior during that meeting." Camilla's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly, her gaze sliding to Alara's exposed collarbone with poorly hidden distaste. "I simply find it curious, is all, that a man of your position would choose to display such an unconventional companion so openly. Surely there are more, shall we say, comfortable arrangements available to you." "I am not interested in comfortable arrangements." Roderick's voice carried clearly across the small circle of onlookers who had gathered to watch the exchange, and he did not lower it, seemingly unconcerned by the attention. "I am interested in a woman of genuine skill, genuine courage, and genuine honesty, qualities I have found remarkably rare among the company I am usually expected to keep." A ripple of murmurs spread through the nearby crowd, and Camilla's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, though she said nothing further, apparently recognizing that any additional cruelty would only reflect poorly on herself in front of so many witnesses. She retreated with as much dignity as she could manage, and Alara let out a slow, careful breath, grateful the confrontation had ended without further incident. "Are you well?" Roderick asked quietly, leaning close enough that only she could hear him. "I am better than well," she said, and found she meant it. Something about facing Camilla directly, with Roderick steady beside her rather than absent as she had feared he might be, had settled a fear she had been carrying for weeks. "I think I have simply been waiting to see if I could survive a moment like that. Now that I have, I find it was not nearly as frightening as I imagined. The rest of the evening passed in a strange, wonderful blur. Not everyone in the room welcomed her presence warmly, and there were still moments of cold stares and whispered comments carried just loud enough to be heard. But there were also unexpected kindnesses, families who approached with genuine curiosity about her work, elderly nobles who spoke to her about the fine craftsmanship of her gown, without a single glance toward her scar, younger guests who seemed almost thrilled by the romantic scandal of it all, and treated her with something close to admiration rather than scorn. Near the end of the evening, as the orchestra shifted into a slower piece and couples began moving toward the dance floor, Roderick led her to the center of the room, ignoring the renewed murmur of attention that followed them. "I have a request to make," he said, his hand settling at her waist as the music began, "though I suspect you will find it rather bold, given everything we have already survived tonight. I am listening. I intend to announce our engagement before this gala concludes." He said it plainly, watching her face carefully for her reaction. "I have already spoken with my mother again this week. She remains cautious, but she has agreed to withhold judgment until she has met you properly, which I consider significant progress given her initial reaction. I do not wish to wait any longer to make my intentions known to the entire city, rather than simply allowing them to whisper and speculate as they have been doing for weeks." Ilara's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must be able to feel it beneath his hands. "Are you certain? Once you say the words, there will be no taking them back. Every family in this room will know, and by morning, every family in the city will know as well." "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." His pale eyes held hers steadily, no trace of doubt or hesitation in them. "I do not want to hide what I feel for you any longer, Ilara. I do not want careful private visits and quiet arrangements. I want the entire world to know that I have chosen you, scars and all, because you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I refuse to spend one more day pretending otherwise." "Then ask me properly," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, though something bright and fierce was building in her chest, chasing away the last remnants of fear that had followed her for so many years. "Not here, in the middle of a dance floor, in front of an audience waiting to judge my answer." He smiled then, wide and genuine, the composed mask of the Iron Duke falling away entirely to reveal simply a man deeply, hopelessly in love. "Come with me." He led her through a set of glass doors onto a quiet balcony overlooking the gardens below, the noise of the ballroom fading into a soft, distant hum behind them. The night air was cool and clear, stars scattered overhead exactly as they had been when she left her small room above the shop earlier that evening, and for a moment, the two of them simply stood together in comfortable silence, looking out over the moonlit grounds. Then Roderick turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his, and dropped to one knee without a trace of hesitation or nervousness, only a quiet, steady certainty that seemed to settle over the entire moment, like warm sunlight breaking through clouds. "Ilara Voss," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet night air, "I have spent my entire life being told what I should want, what I should value, who I should choose to spend my life beside. I have never once, in 31 years, felt anything close to what I feel whenever I am near you. And you have shown me more honesty, more courage, and more genuine kindness in a few short months than I have witnessed in a lifetime surrounded by wealth and status. I do not care what the city whispers about scars or stations or suitability. I care only that you are the finest person I have ever known, and I cannot imagine spending the rest of my life without you beside me. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed freely down her cheeks now, and she found she did not care, did not feel the old urge to hide them or apologize for them. "Yes," she said, laughing through the tears, the word coming easily, and without a single trace of doubt. "Yes, I will marry you." He rose and pulled her close, and when he kissed her, gentle and certain beneath the scattered stars, she felt every fear she had carried for years finally begin to dissolve, replaced by a quiet, steady joy she had not believed herself capable of feeling again, after the fire had taken so much from her. When they returned to the ballroom hand in hand, the announcement spread through the crowd like wildfire, and though there were still a few cold stares and pointed whispers scattered among the guests, they were far outnumbered by genuine congratulations, warm smiles, and the kind of curious excitement that came from witnessing something rare and unexpected. Even the Duchess Wilhelmina, who had arrived partway through the evening at her son's quiet insistence, watched the announcement from across the room with an expression that, while not entirely warm, held none of the harsh disapproval Ilara had feared. The following months were not without difficulty. There were still uncomfortable dinners with skeptical relatives, still occasional cruel comments from those who could not accept a duke choosing a seamstress over a title, Still moments where Alara caught herself instinctively reaching to cover her scar before remembering, with growing confidence, that she no longer needed to hide. But with each passing week, the whispers grew quieter, replaced gradually by genuine acceptance as more and more people came to know Alara not as a scandal or a curiosity, but simply as a remarkable woman who had earned every ounce of happiness now coming her way. The wedding took place in early spring, in a small stone chapel just outside the city, chosen specifically because it reminded Alara of the modest shop where her parents had once worked together with quiet devotion. She wore a gown of her own design, pale gold silk that caught the morning light beautifully, with sleeves that left her scar fully visible, exactly as she had chosen to wear it that night at the gala. Mildred cried through the entire ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that had long since given up any pretense of dryness. Even Duchess Wilhelmina, who had grown considerably warmer toward Alara over the preceding months, allowed herself a rare, genuine smile as she watched her son exchange vows with the woman who had so thoroughly changed his life. As Roderick slipped a simple gold ring onto her finger, his eyes never once leaving her face, Alara thought back to the frightened girl who had spent years hiding behind carefully arranged hair and lowered eyes, convinced that a scar meant she was somehow less deserving of love, of respect, of a life filled with genuine happiness. That girl had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by a woman who stood tall in front of everyone who had once doubted her, scar visible and unashamed, marrying a man who had chosen her not despite her past, but because of the strength and character that past had helped shape. "I love you," Roderick murmured, quiet enough that only she could hear it, as the priest continued the final words of the ceremony. "Exactly as you are." "I love you too," she whispered back, meaning it more completely than she had ever meant anything in her entire life. Later that evening, as the wedding celebration continued in the grand hall of the Thornwood estate, Alara found a quiet moment to step outside onto a balcony, much like the one where Roderick had proposed, looking out over gardens now blooming with the first flowers of spring. He joined her a few minutes later, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently against her shoulder. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. She thought about the question seriously, considering the weeks of gossip, the humiliation at the Ashworth estate, the fear that had gripped her heart more times than she could count throughout this entire journey. And then she thought about this moment, standing here as his wife, no longer hiding, no longer apologizing for a scar she had carried since childhood, surrounded by people who had finally come to see her, exactly as Roderick always had, from that very first day in the shop. "None," she said honestly, turning in his arms to face him fully. "Every difficult moment led us here, to this exact moment, and I would not trade it for an easier path that led somewhere less true." He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that had once seemed so impossible from a man the entire city called cold and unmoved, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, then to the scar along her collarbone that had once caused her so much pain, and finally to her lips, soft and certain beneath the spring stars. Behind them the sounds of celebration continued, laughter and music drifting out into the night, but for a long, quiet moment, none of it mattered nearly as much as the simple, steady joy of standing together, finally free of every doubt and every whisper that had once tried to convince them they did not belong beside each other. The girl the city had once called unworthy of love had found, in the end, exactly the kind of love that mattered most, not the kind built on appearances or convenient alliances, but the kind built on honesty, respect, and the quiet, unshakable choice to see someone completely, scars and all, and love them entirely because of it, rather than in spite of it. And as for the Iron Duke, the man so many had believed incapable of warmth or genuine feeling, he had finally found what he had spent his entire life searching for without ever quite knowing its name, a partner who valued him not for his title or his fortune, but simply for the man he chose to be when no one was watching, and who had taught him, in turn, that true strength was never about hiding one's scars, but about learning to stand in the light and let them be seen.